They had laughed when they first saw John B. George's mail-order rifle. It was the kind of gun you'd expect to see on a shooting range in Illinois, not in Guadalcanal, fighting against the empire of the rising sun. But now, as the dawn breaks over the cursed ridge he is trapped in, George cannot afford to doubt his weapon. A sound comes from above, too deliberate to be the wind, and too close to ignore. George raises the scope and sends 3 quick shots into the trees. The hill answers with a single word: Banzai. For John B. George, shooting a rifle was never just a hobby, much less a game. So as he raised his weapon at the 1,000-yard line during the Illinois State Championships, there was a sense that the shot ahead of him mattered far more than the title he was competing for. He set the distant target through the sights. Not a single muscle moved. Not a breath escaped. Before pulling the trigger, he muttered the same prayer he always did, quote, "Please, Lord, let it be on the target, and let the damn man in the pits find it soon, before the suspense kills me." The bullet tore through the barrel of his national match rifle. The strike was only a 4, yet George remained firm. He wasn't done yet. He went back to clicking his sights, calculating the windage until he was ready for another shot. He squeezed. It took 2 long seconds for the bullet to land dead center on the bullseye. George didn't allow himself to celebrate. Another round cracked through the air, then another. It wasn't until the final shot echoed across the range that he returned to himself. He looked around at the makeshift firing line, and the onlookers gathered behind him, many struggling to hide their amazement. John B. George had just become the youngest .30 caliber champion in Illinois history. The men at the Chicago Rifle Club crowded around their new champion. Amid the cheers and congratulatory slaps on the back, Ken Smith, the club's president, suddenly stepped forward, his expression unusually serious. Grabbing George by the shoulder, he leaned in and asked, quote, "George, think you could do as well on targets that shoot back? I sure as hell hope that you, and about 1 million other guys, can shoot well in the next few years. A lot may depend on it." The year was 1938. The Third Reich and the Empire of the Rising Sun were already preparing to strike, about to unleash a war unlike anything the world had ever seen. George hoped he would never have to use his skill to end a man's life. But as he would later say, quote, "If my freedom and my life was ever placed in jeopardy by aggressors, my rifle was hanging ready on the wall." Before the United States had even entered the war, George was already enrolled in the 132nd Infantry of the Illinois National Guard, training at Camp Forest, Tennessee. However, even for a champion like himself, training for combat was not an easy task. Instead of being handed the rifle he knew so well, George was assigned as a machine gun platoon leader. These were the men tasked with hauling water-cooled M1917 Browning machine guns, weapons built to saturate entire sections with fire, not to hunt targets with the sort of precision George had already mastered. To make matters worse, there were no shooting competitions anywhere nearby, which took away his best way to keep his rifle skills sharp. The men at Camp Forest were far from the riflemen America needed. According to George himself, his service while stationed at the base was, quote, "a constant revelation of our nation's pathetic state of unpreparedness." While there were a handful of veterans and fellow military enthusiasts like George who could conjure a decent shot, most of the men around him didn't know how to properly hold a weapon, let alone secure a moving target across a battlefield. Command, meanwhile, seemed more focused on trivial subjects like housekeeping chores. At best, recruits would receive some occasional hand-to-hand combat, but that didn't make George any more confident about the future of his platoon. Some units never received any proper rifle practice. Even those who did were hardly guaranteed to become effective shooters, as most of the instructors had never fired in anger, as George would describe, and instead only followed manual instructions they barely understood. George understood that no one at Camp Forest would teach these men how to survive on a battlefield, and if he wanted his unit to stand any chance at all, he had to take matters into his own hands. It was on a rainy morning that George finally took a group of men and a few assistant instructors out into the field. Days of protest to his superiors had earned him a single morning, one brief window to try and turn these men into something resembling combat-ready soldiers. There was no time to go into firing positions or advanced techniques. George had to settle for the bare fundamentals of rifle shooting: how to find a target through the sights, when to pull the trigger, and how to reload for a follow-up shot. The recruits gripped their weapons, leveled their barrels toward the distant targets, and opened fire. George couldn't hide his horror as the shooting began. He later admitted, quote, "Groups were generally pathetic. All of the company officers were distressed, if not thoroughly disgusted." That day, the men fired barely 15 rounds each. For many of them, it would be the only rifle practice they ever received before commanders loaded them onto ships and sent them overseas. George understood that many of those men would never make it home. But he was determined not to be one of them. Even with inadequate training and comrades who might not be able to cover his back on the front line, George resolved to survive. And if that meant having to shoot every enemy standing between him and survival, then so be it. It was late 1941 when George turned on the radio in his car, only to hear the host speak so fast he couldn't keep up. He switched stations only to find the same story. It took several more minutes of driving before the message finally broke through the static. Japan had just bombed Pearl Harbor. George knew that the moment had arrived. But if he was going overseas, he intended to do it on his own terms. Even if most officials hadn't accepted it yet, he understood the coming war would demand precision shooters to do the work heavy weapons could not. As soldiers scrambled to pack their gear and load weapons onto ships bound for the Pacific, George wired a friend in Illinois and called his parents with a single request before deployment: ship him a pair of M1903 Springfield rifles with excellent barrels and crisp triggers. Along with them, he also asked for a G&H mount, rugged enough for the battlefield, and a Lyman Alaskan scope he could use to see through the jungle shadows and find the spot where the Japanese hid. But above all this, the most important thing was for him to be sent his personal Winchester Model 70, the rifle that felt like an extension of his own arm, and his best chance at surviving what lay ahead as troops sailed on to Guadalcanal. While Japanese forces had already been badly battered by the time George and his fellow troops arrived on the island, it was evident that there was still a lot of work for him and his rifle to do. Entrenched enemy garrisons still clung to the jungle and ridgelines. Any patch of land America wanted would have to be torn from them, one man at a time. Many soldiers might have preferred to wait it out, letting starvation and sickness finish the job. But George wasn't wired that way. In just 3 days after his arrival on the island, on December 8th, 1942, he was already climbing into a jeep with a pair of borrowed binoculars and his rifle. It was time to find out whether his championship shooting skills would prove just as sharp in the jungle as they had back home. George left Henderson Field, the American base on the island, shortly before dawn, riding out alongside Lieutenant Art Handel. Their target was Point Cruz, in the northwestern section of the island, where heavily fortified Japanese bunkers still posed a threat to any American force trying to secure the nearby shoreline. As they departed, more than one soldier turned to wave at them, calling out, quote, "Don't get shot." Sweat streamed down George and Hantel's foreheads as they pushed deeper into the jungle, and the distant thump of artillery echoed through the trees, each blast sounding closer than the last. George floored the vehicle's gas pedal, but the thick mud clung to the wheels, making it nearly impossible to move quickly beneath the dense jungle canopy. As the men struggled to get the vehicle moving, the terrain grew more and more sinister. Months of gunfire and naval bombardment had erased nearly every living thing, leaving behind a barren stretch of ground where the stench of war was almost unbearable. Despite the shock, George pushed ahead. Alongside Handel, he opted to jump from the vehicle and climb the rest of the hill on foot. From the crest, without even lifting his binoculars, he could already see Japanese entrenchments spread across the terrain below. It was time to get to work. From a shallow hole that offered a clear view of the area, George and Handel scanned the horizon, binoculars sweeping back and forth, searching for movement, any telltale sign about where the Japanese were hiding. But as the sun beat down and their eyes began to blur, there were no leads. Handel lowered his binoculars in frustration, muttering, quote, "I don't believe there's a damn thing down there." Yet almost as soon as he was done speaking, a bullet snapped past them from below, slicing through the air, close enough to force both men flat against the ground. Still, they could not spot a single object moving beneath. Suddenly, the sound of crunching leaves and snapping twigs rose behind them. For a moment, neither man dared to move, rifles ready to fire. They would not let their guard down until an American sergeant emerged from the brush. The men let out a sigh of relief as the sergeant dropped into the hole beside them and pointed ahead, quote, "See those two coconut trees leaning toward each other, down there to your right front. There's some kind of bunker or pillbox down there. The lieutenant just saw a Jap go inside. We're going to drop about a dozen delayed action grenades on it. If they try to make a break for it, trying to get the hell out while it's blowing, you let him have it." George and Handel nodded, leveling their rifles at the exact point the sergeant had marked. As the first mortars were launched, George kept his eye fixed on the bunker through his rifle's scope, his body perfectly still. The explosions hit like an earthquake, tearing through the ground and shaking the entire area. Handel couldn't hide his astonishment, exclaiming, quote, "Christ, just think how they must feel down there." But George didn't have time to be impressed by the colossal force of the explosions. At any moment, the Japanese would be forced out of their hiding place, and he might only get one chance. Mortars continued to rain down on the position until the roof finally split in two, and the makeshift structure collapsed in on itself. George held his aim steady, watching the cloud of smoke as it cleared. There had been no sign of enemy movement during the barrage, but now a faint silhouette started to emerge from the wreckage. Not far from the shattered bunker, a man struggled back to his feet, fully exposed, still reeling from the blast. George had to fire now. With the utmost care, he squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked ever so slightly as the shot broke, but by the time he brought the scope back on target, he saw the bullet strike true. George later stated, quote, "As he toppled forward onto his face, I let him have two more for good measure." It was the first man George had ever taken out, but he could not dwell on it. Almost immediately, Handel pointed to movement, another Japanese soldier climbing out of the wreckage. George shifted position in a heartbeat, snapping the new target into his sights and firing instantly. The bullet passed just wide. The enemy, realizing he was being targeted, threw himself to the ground and began crawling away, desperate to escape. He wasn't fast enough. George corrected his aim and fired again. Then once more. He kept shooting until his rifle was empty. This time, the Japanese soldier did not get so lucky. George's first sniping mission was over. He'd taken down 2 enemy soldiers, but he was certain he could do better. Only a week had passed since George's combat baptism when his next mission was laid out. He hadn't had nearly enough time to grow familiar with Guadalcanal's treacherous terrain, much less master the unforgiving art of jungle warfare. Still, if he could shoot even half as well as he had during his sniping debut, he stood as America's best chance of driving the last Japanese forces off the island. This time, the fight was set to take place at Mount Austin, a canopy-choked ridgeline rising more than 1,500 feet above the northern shore, not far from the ground George and Handel had cleared days earlier. Its summit was a natural fortress. From there, the enemy could watch American movements around the nearby Henderson Field and launch sudden, violent ambushes that kept U.S. troops on their toes. If Mount Austin fell, Guadalcanal would soon follow. The operation demanded speed and precision. The entrenched Japanese forces had to be cut off before they could retreat or organize a counterattack. To do that, the advancing troops were forced to leave behind most of their heavy equipment and machine guns, anything that might slow them down. They would move only with limited ammunition and light weapons. For many men, that would have been reason enough to turn back. Not for John B. George. He was more comfortable with a rifle anyway. As he took his first steps up the steep incline toward Mount Austin, he trusted that his mail-ordered rifle would be more than enough to get the job done. However, before George could fire a single shot, he first had to survive the climb. And in those first hours, every man knew that every step forward was a gamble. The Americans were badly exposed, advancing uphill, while Japanese troops lay hidden in carefully prepared positions all along the route. Years later, George would still remember the sound that made his blood run cold. Sharp pops like champagne corks, but which were actually enemy grenades, being spat out of jungle-held launchers. There was no time for protest. After every charge, George had to, quote, rise up from the dirt, shake his head, curse, and feel all over for blood before pushing forward again. The Americans barely had enough firepower to defend themselves against these attacks, let alone the equipment needed to set up a proper aid station. George later remembered seeing nearly a dozen wounded men and realizing that they would never make it back down the hill alive. But the worst came when the sun went down. Darkness fell over the hillside like a blindfold. Throughout the night, the Americans could hear the enemy moving all around them, boots crunching, weapons readied, yet they couldn't fire back. Ammunition was too scarce to waste on shadows slipping between the trees. All George could do was find a hole and stay as still as possible, hoping enemy mortars wouldn't find him as he tried to steal a few moments of sleep before the climb resumed. However, none would get to have a proper rest that night. As the hours passed, Japanese heavy mortars kept on crashing down, forcing soldiers to leap from their shallow holes before they were blasted apart. Dawn hadn't yet arrived when George heard Japanese boots moving closer. They hadn't spotted him yet, but they were setting up a machine gun nest above his position, opening fire on American troops further down the slope. Any attempt to return fire was useless. Each time George tried to peek out, bullets snapped inches above his head. For a moment, all George could think of was that he had come this far, only to be pinned down before unleashing the full power of his rifle. He even turned to the other man, sharing his foxhole, and asked which of them he thought would earn the Purple Heart that night. But before they could find the answer to that question, the firing suddenly stopped. For a brief moment, all that could be heard was the sound of birds and the faint rustle of leaves as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. For the first time in hours, George dared to rise from his hole. No bullets, no mortars, no movement. Before the Japanese could deliver the final blow, American artillery had wiped them out with a miraculous salvo of 105mm shells. George later said, quote, "Sometimes the thing those artillerymen did made you want to kiss them, or get them twice as drunk as they'd ever been before." The artillery had brought George one more day to live, and he intended to spend it wiping every last Japanese soldier from the top of that hill. The colonel leading the charge up Mount Austin had warned his commanders not to, quote, "go popping away or play Boy Scout." But George knew that the Americans wouldn't be able to take another step into that terrain unless someone first cleared the path ahead. Few men were willing to run solo sniper missions, but George didn't hesitate before he was already pushing deep into the jungle, slipping past an abandoned Japanese nest and continuing uphill until he found a position high enough to command a clear view of the enemy-held field ahead. Guadalcanal sat deep in the southern hemisphere, and December meant peak summer. The sun was merciless. Men left exposed for too long had to be brought back to base after hallucinogens set in. But for a sniper like George, there was no other choice but to face the heat and hope for the best. He found what little shade he could and settled in, prepared to lie motionless for hours, eyes locked on the slightest hint of movement. Before long, sweat poured down his forehead and into his eyes, blurring already strained vision. Heat waves shimmered across the terrain, the landscape dissolving into impossible shapes. But just as everything ahead seemed to merge into a single meaningless blur, a shout cut through the heat, quote, "Get down, you crazy bastard." George turned sharply and saw an American soldier standing upright at the crest of the hill. He'd inexplicably opted to come out of his foxhole, perhaps confused by heat stroke, and was now widely exposed. There was no time to pull him down. Almost immediately, a rifle cracked from the jungle below. George recognized the sound at once. It was the sharp report of a Japanese Arisaka rifle. The exposed American soldier dropped where he stood, struck right in the chest. There was no time for George to oversee the retrieval of his body, as instinct took over. George swung his rifle toward the place where the shot had come from. Straining to keep his vision steady, he caught movement below. A man sprinting through the canopy, and another. George froze. At that distance, silhouettes meant nothing. Friend or foe could look the same in the jungle, and while Guadalcanal had to be won, George was not willing to release a premature shot, just to end up claiming an Allied soldier's life. Every instinct screamed at him to fire, yet George forced himself to wait. He studied the figures carefully. Their height, their posture, and the color of their uniforms were still not enough. Then, as one of the men turned to face directly at George, he could finally spot the telltale sign: a pair of wrapped leggings. No American soldier on the island wore a garment that even closely resembled this. He fired instantly, cycling the bolt, even before the first shot finished echoing through the trees. Training urged him to keep firing, but through the scope, he could confirm that the target was down. He'd made the right call in saving his munitions, as almost immediately, a second Japanese soldier burst from cover, flushed out by an American grenade, which followed George's initial strike. The enemy was crawling across the ground, trying to escape the blast zone, but in doing so, he had inadvertently run right into sightline. George tried to track the man as calmly as possible, waiting for just the right moment to strike. Predicting his path, he moved the scope ahead, letting the Japanese keep on crawling until he was right at the center of his view. The shot went by so fast that by the time George settled his scope again, the second target was already motionless. However, George barely had time to savor his victory, as almost as soon as the kill was confirmed, the heat's burden came crashing back. Cold sweat spread across George's body. His legs trembled as he shifted, despite having lain still for hours. The sniper knew it was time to call it a day and come back to base. For the next several weeks, George kept returning to the battlefield time and again, using his faithful rifle as his main weapon. Yet not even months of practice in that brutal terrain could have prepared him for the mission that came in the early hours of January 7th. An American platoon had held a line near the summit of Mount Austin throughout the night, firing at shadows moving in the darkness, without being able to confirm a single hit. As dawn approached, there was only one man willing to move ahead and make certain the ground was clear before the final push. John B. George was heading to the front once more. The snipers slipped deep into enemy-controlled territory, nearly 50 yards beyond the outer American line. Every movement was deliberate and silent, his rifle trained constantly on the trees ahead. The jungle lay still as the first faint light crept across the sky, nothing but shadows and an uneasy silence. Then a rifle cracked from the canopy. The round passed so close to George's head that he heard it hiss beside his ear. In one fluid motion, he dropped flat to the ground, his rifle never wavering from the direction of the shot. Through the scope, George searched for movement, but there was nothing. It was as if the enemy had vanished. Suddenly, a faint bang sounded behind him. George snapped around, ready to fire, but instead of a Japanese soldier, he spotted two American riflemen dug into nearby foxholes, hunting the same unseen shooter trying to pin George down. Without letting a single second pass, George dashed toward them, diving into cover as the three men scanned the jungle ahead, waiting for the next move. Seconds stretched into minutes, or perhaps hours. Time lost all meaning as every rustle of leaves felt like a countdown for George and his companions to meet their demise. Then something moved high in a tree. It could have been an animal, or it could have been a Japanese soldier positioning himself to strike. George wasn't willing to wait and find out. He raised his rifle, centered the scope, and fired 3 quick shots into the canopy. The moment the final round left the barrel, George heard the most terrifying sound he'd encountered since arriving on Guadalcanal. Years later, he could still recall it vividly, quote, a chorus yell of the same word, Banzai, Banzai, high-pitched, blood-curdling, croaking with fanaticism, savagery, hate. Time seemed to run in slow motion. 5 Japanese attackers burst from cover, charging downhill. Some clutched bayonets, others rifles, but all wore the same wild, feral expression as they rushed forward, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice if it meant annihilating the 3 Americans before them. There were only seconds to react. George and the rifleman fired at once. George's first shot slipped past the lead attacker, but instead of giving up, the bullet kept on rushing until it tore into the man at the rear, cutting him down instantly. George worked the bolt and fired again, striking another attacker, though not enough to stop him. He went to fire once more and felt his stomach drop. His rifle was empty, yet 2 attackers were still charging straight at him. For a split second, George believed it was over. But before everything turned dark, the American rifleman on his flanks cracked once more. The shots of the men next to George found their marks just in time, leaving the attacks on the ground before they could reach the foxholes. Before leaving the U.S., George had lost almost all faith in the shooting ability of the men around him. But at that moment, faith was coming back to him. George later confessed, quote, "What I saw during those few seconds made me glow with pride at my belonging in the same outfit with the 2 men out in front. They'd eliminated twice their number of Japs, with only minor assistance. They'd not lost nerve in the face of the most savage and terrifying weapon in the Japanese repertoire." 2 days later, George and the rest of the battalion that had fought its way toward Mount Austin's peak were finally relieved. By then, an estimated 500 Japanese soldiers had been taken out. George never specified how many of those victories were his in his post-war memoirs, but it's safe to say that the victory over what the Japanese later called the Battle of the Mountain of Blood was due in no small part to the riflemen who had not only survived one of the most brutal battlefields of the war, but it also helped forge a new generation of American shooters who would soon give their enemies across the Pacific hell. By early February, the last Japanese troops were evacuated from Guadalcanal, the Imperial command finally conceding that the island could not be retaken. However, for John B. George, that triumph wasn't enough. Still hungry for the fight, he didn't hesitate when the chance came to deploy again, this time to Burma in Southeast Asia, where Allied forces desperately needed men who could hunt the enemy with nothing more than a well-aimed rifle. And that is exactly what George was born for.